So today we're going to have a panel, and I'm really proud to say that it is entirely composed of patient partners. Often we see panels on patient engagement, maybe not often still, but quite frequently we see panels on patient engagement where there actually are no patients on the panel. So we've reversed that, and every person on this panel is here because they are a person with lived experience. So we're really excited about that. This is going to be an interactive session. So you'll sit for a little bit so you can digest, and enjoy a little bit of your coffee. But in about 40 minutes, you're going to be working with your groups. And then after that, you'll be moving around from table to table. So, and we know that this is going to be a great session. There'll be lots of questions and lots of interaction. We've already started all that interaction on the boat yesterday. So we're a really great crowd. So we're really looking forward to it. And we've got 3 objectives for the session. Okay, so we're going to describe the common challenges and concerns that participants face during clinical trials and explain how these issues impact their overall experience. We're going to identify and implement practical strategies to improve participant experiences, accessibility, and comfort during clinical trials. And we'll understand the benefits of involving patient partners to identify barriers and co-create patient-centered solutions to clinical trials. So in this panel, the people who are here have all been patient partners. Many of them have also been participants in clinical trials. So we're going to be talking really about both. So we'll be talking about the experience of participants, and we'll be talking about how patient partners can work with you to improve clinical trials and, as the title says, make them less awful and reduce those burdens. So I'd like to invite the panel up. All right, thank you. So I'm going to let the panelists do their own introductions to you. When I'm going to call on each of them with one question to get us started. They're going to answer that question. Then I'm going to have a few questions that they might chime in differently, and then I'm going to hand it over to the audience to ask their questions. So I'm just going to name the people, and then after that I'll call on them and they can introduce themselves. So at the far end we have Trinity Lothian. And then next to Trinity is Dawn Richards. And next to Dawn is Ron Thompson. And then we have Benji Fleischer, and Benji's 13 years old. And we have Michelle Wan, who's Benji's very proud mother. So I'm going to start with Benji and Michelle, who are going to kind of share the limelight and ask them the first question to get us started. And like I said, they'll start by introducing themselves a little bit. But my question is, okay, so after you've introduced yourselves, can you share your experience when Michelle was a parent partner in a clinical trial and Benji was the youth partner?
Okay, so hi, because I can never hear. My name's Michelle. I'm the mother of 2 teens. One of them is Benjamin, and my daughter is 15. And been involved in the hospital system for 15 years. My daughter was a NICU baby at Sick Kids, and she's in complex care. So very familiar with all levels of the healthcare system, and have just started getting into the last 3 years into patient partner work, which I find very rewarding. As a parent, we're very isolated sometimes in medical complexity. So this is just a great community, and I feel like I can contribute and feel some give back for everything that we've received.
I'm Benji. I'm 13, a student, and I like ramen noodles.
Okay, so to talk about the project we were involved in, just a brief background. This was a project that involved a game designed on the iPad for children, and it was to be done in the home every day and supported by caregivers. So the research team had already done phase 1 of a clinical trial, and they had some challenges. There was about a 17% attrition rate at the time, and they were looking to involve patient partners and caregivers to see if they could address that and to improve. And so when I started talking with them, I could tell right away they really wanted to build an authentic partnership. They had not worked with partners before. And so it was a dialogue. It was like, let's get to know each other. It wasn't anything about the project. And that really built trust. We built rapport. And then when we got into talking about the project, they said the challenges and what they wanted to do. And they really started talking about, well, how would you like to contribute? And what are your interests? And what are your skills? So we really able to hone in on how I could contribute. And then they said, okay, well, we want to improve the game design. I said, well, I don't know anything about games. You really need to talk to someone who's young. And so that's kind of how Benjamin became involved in the project. So for me, I felt much more comfortable looking at the education materials that were going to go to the caregivers. So when I reviewed phase one, it was this big, long document, 20 pages, had a lot of scientific terms, a lot of acronyms. And so I said, okay, we got to cut this down. And, you know, if you were designed, if you had to support the child, if I was a participant, I would have to be one step ahead of the child. So we broke this down into just-in-time learning chunks. So if the participant child was in level 1, then I'm going to read level 1, and then I'm going to go support them. And then as they progress, level 2, level 3, then I just want to read level 2, and then we'll do level 2. The other thing I suggested was finding ways to support different learning styles. Maybe reading isn't your thing, so perhaps having a Zoom meeting where you could ask questions, get live feedback, and then if this was done in a group setting, that could also serve as a form of peer support.
My role was to improve game design for the kid participants in phase 2. When I tested the phase 1 version, I found that the gameplay was very basic and the difficulty progression was too fast, so it was very frustrating when I couldn't beat the levels. It was like a school kid learning how to count on day 1 and then learning calculus on day 2, basically. At the end of the game session, there was a pop-up window with the question, did you use a metacognitive skill? I did not know what a metacognitive skill was, and I don't think most 8-year-olds would know either. The phase 1 game also had a complicated graphs and charts on a dashboard to monitor your progress, but the font was very small and I couldn't even read it, and I have 20/20 vision. I met with the research team and my 6 suggestions to them were, 1, don't call it a video game. If you call it a video game, it's kind of boring, but if you call it therapy that uses gaming, it seems more fun than just regular boring therapy. 2, slow down the difficulty progression. If it's too fast, the kids will get frustrated and quit. 3, use regular words that a child would know so they don't get confused. 4, don't ask questions when the kids are in the middle of playing the game. Leave this until the end. 5, include in-game prizes to keep the kids motivated. We need incentives. And finally, get rid of the scientific dashboard and charts. Kids are not interested in it.
So we were really pleased that the team really listened to the suggestions and they were able to sort of apply a lot of the changes that we had suggested. And they had a little presentation about how phase 2 went, and happy to report that the attrition rate, it pretty much went down to 0. And so we'd like to think that, you know, that perhaps we had a small part in this due to the success, and it was really about building those authentic partnerships with people with lived experience.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm sure you had a big part of the attrition rate going down to 0. That was great. So we'll hand it over to Ron Thompson. And one of the biggest obstacles to inclusive clinical trials is at the point of study design. So can you share your experiences with study design in trials for your son?
Yeah, okay, thank you, Maureen. So I have 3 kids, and the youngest child, who's 5 now, was born with HIE. Now, right off the bat, do people know what HIE is? So kind of to Benji's point, how about, does it help if I say hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy? Does that help? So I think this is one of the first obstacles, to echo what Benji's saying, and it's not just about kids, it's about parents. If language is used, and my day job is, I'm an applied linguist, and I teach a course on language and power and how we use language in discourse communities in a way that sort of unintentionally divides people, because it kind of excludes people that don't have terminology. And there's all these subdisciplines. When I sit at tables here and hear people talking about things that I'm unfamiliar with, I feel excluded. And so I think if I feel that way, like in my day job, I'm well aware of metacognitive skills, but I think most adults probably aren't. So when we're talking about language, that's the first obstacle that I want to talk about, is that if I see a study that doesn't look inviting because I don't understand what it is, and this happened from birth when they said, your son has HIE, and just left it at that, it's this feeling of exclusion. But the other issue is that when you have a kid that is medically complex, which my son is, and he's got global brain injury, I just use English. I say he's, suffered a global brain injury at birth because he didn't get oxygen. And because he's medically complex, studies tend to be inaccessible to him. So recently, there are very few studies, first of all, but recently there was a study that was being promoted looking at the use of metformin, and he was excluded because the methodology, there was no way of measuring him because he can't move his arms, and so he can't respond to show whether or not he understands something. So right off the bat, you're excluding a population because of your method. Another thing about that method is that when you have a medically complex kid, if I'm told you need to bring your child at 9 o'clock for an appointment, I can't guarantee that I'm going to get him there at 9 o'clock. I don't know if I have to pull over on the way to Toronto. I could be an hour late. There needs to be flexibility in access. And also there's a larger group. So mom can't necessarily go on her own because when we travel, we have to have 2 adults. I also think it's important to think about fathers because for whatever reason, my son Samuel calms down with me. Maybe I'm mean, I don't know, but somehow I can calm him down in a way that mom can't sometimes. And so studies need to be able to accommodate me coming. Last thing I'll say is in my own research, linguistic research, I've tried to apply those exact principles. So I was engaged in a longitudinal study. And in order to get my participant who initially came to my lab, the person was no longer able to do that. And she owned a convenience store and I had to go to a convenience store and in between customers record her. So this kind of creative thinking, I think, makes things more ecologically valid, meaning that it represents the real world if we think about our methods and say, who can we accommodate and who are we excluding?
Thanks. Thanks so much, Ron. I'm going to skip over you, Dawn. I'm going to save you for last. Over to Trinity. So Trinity, can you touch on the benefits of including patient partners at all stages of the research process to foster positive study outcomes for participants and for research team members?
Perfect. Thank you, Maureen. So just a little introduction. My name is Trinity, and I've been a youth partner with Lauren, started with her with C4T a few years ago, and have had the opportunity to speak a few times about the benefits of always including patient partners. So it feels kind of like a broken record at this point, and I hope that everyone in this room kind of has a sense of the benefits. And at this point, it's 2024, why it's important to be including patient partners and family partners in your research. But in case you aren't up to speed, I'm hoping that we can do a quick summary over this and then dive into some of the better, more deeper questions that have been overlooked in the past few years. But essentially, some of the benefits all the way from the beginning of the research stage, when you include patient partners, can really include, even before the funding gets approved, they can have a look at your budget and really decide, okay, let's put the funding where it matters. And we understand that for participants, a clinical trial, like, it isn't Club Med. It's not going to be perfect, but we can make it as good an experience for the participants as possible. So we might look, and of course, when researchers are designing studies, I've been on the research side of things purely as a student and the patient side of things as a patient partner. And on the research side of things, you're looking at, okay, the organ systems, how the medication is working, looking specifically at the science. The patient partners can really help put into perspective the human that's there, the whole person. So things like the compensation, the timing of study visits, of clinic visits, appointments, testing, things like the consent forms and making them clear and understandable to patients, using the language, as Ron said, that patients will actually understand and the participants can use to make their informed decision. And even the language that the researchers are using when discussing things with the participants, those are all things that the patient partners can help inform the researchers about and make the experience better for the participants. And in turn, it will also make the experience better for the researchers. Recruitment will improve. They'll have better retention in the studies, and even getting all the way back to the end of the study, the end of this research process, going into the KT, the patient partners can really help make that knowledge accessible to not only the participants in the study, because they deserve to know what their effort went towards, but also the general public. And as was mentioned yesterday, the perception that the general public here in Canada has about clinical trials, the more accessible we make the information that's already out there, the more positive that general perception can become. And so in turn, that will lead to the better recruitment, more funding opportunities, et cetera. So at any stage, it's really positive to include patient partners. And I hope that now everyone can be on the same page. And the question about why it's good to include patient partners can kind of be squashed a little bit because it's been repetitive over the past few years. But thank you, Maureen.
Thanks, Trinity. I agree with you. We sound like a broken record because for some reason we keep having to repeat it. But and it's great to hear it again. That was great insight. So I'm going to hand it over to Dawn Richards. Oh, I didn't ask the question. So excited to hear you speak. So after Dawn introduces herself, so Dawn, as you'll say, Director of Patient and Public Engagement at Clinical Trials Ontario, you have the opportunity to hear a myriad of patient experiences with clinical trials and lead its College of Lived Experience. Can you share with us some information about participation options for clinical trials?
Thanks, Maureen. We mind melded, so I knew the question already. Okay, so as Maureen said, I have a few roles. One of them is the Director of Patient Public Engagement at Clinical Trials Ontario. I'm actually an analytical chemist by training, but I was diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis about 20 years ago. And that's when I first saw patients as partners in research, which pretty much blew my mind. And that really led me to the work that I do today, because I know that researchers are not necessarily trained to work with patients as partners. And it's okay to tell your patient partners that, because they usually assume that this is something you learned in school. So I just want to put that out there first. The work that we do at CTO is we do engage a group called our College of Lived Experience, and we're privileged to have Maureen on that group. We're privileged to have Trinity on that group. And they really inform everything that I do within the organization. And so one of the projects that came out of the pandemic early on was many of you were having to pivot your trials, so they were decentralized or they had hybrid options so that people could participate safely in them. And honestly, I hope those options don't go away, because I think that, and we know from a survey that we've done recently, that participants really appreciate the opportunity for different ways to participate. And that doesn't always mean going to you. Sometimes that means, like what Ron talked about, that means you going to them. So early on in the pandemic, we were having discussions about, well, what do participants think about this? But are they going to do this? Are they going to be okay with this? And so we had conversations with our College of Lived Experience, and they said, yeah, but we're only like 10 or 12 people. Can we do a survey on this? Can we ask other people what they think? And so right there, to your point, Trinity, we got an idea from working with patients as partners. We did a survey where we had about 300 people or so respond across Canada. And they told us we want options to participate in trials. We don't always want to go to a site. We might want to go there to do informed consent, but actually we're pretty okay with technology, and we're okay with just talking to you on the phone, or we're okay with these different approaches. So like 80% of the people who responded to our survey said we want options. We don't always want to go to a site. We'd be okay with things that are fully decentralized, or at least some hybrid options. The thing that they worry about most, especially if it's a medication, is what do I do if something goes wrong? And that's probably not very different from if you've got someone that's regularly coming to a site. Many of them are okay with technology. They said, like, I don't need to go to a site. I don't need to drive 2 hours in Toronto traffic to be consented. I'm totally okay to do that on Zoom. And people were split about privacy concerns. And, what if someone handles your information like a third party or something like that? I always point to the fact that, like, hey, Life Labs had a giant breach a couple of years in Ontario. And actually, I didn't really see very much come out of that in terms of how it was reported, anything that was done about it. So I'm not saying that's okay, but I'm saying we worry about a lot of stuff that other people don't worry about and that isn't that splashy at the end of the day. The other thing we heard from people is that they really feel that this is an opportunity for us to actually action, trials being accessible to people, trials coming to people in Canada that wouldn't normally be able to participate in trials. So I just want to put that out there that the patient partners that we're working with are saying, like, I have a life too. Like, I want to participate in trials, but I also want to be able to continue to live my life, and I don't want to have to drop everything to be a participant in an interesting study. And sometimes my life is going to get in the way if I always have to travel to a place. So just think about it as you heard from the other panelists, talk to people about it, hear what their interesting ideas are, and maybe you can find some creative ways to do things differently.
Thank you, Dawn. Wow, that was an incredible start. So I'm going to give an open question that anyone on the panel can answer. So we've heard lots of challenges that impact the experience that people have when they join clinical trials. Is there something that wasn't mentioned that somebody would like to add to? So we heard a lot about accessibility and decentralized and a lot of different things, but is there something else that you can think of that merits making the list here? Dawn?
I think one thing we need to think about too is how people find out about trials. Their healthcare providers can be so-called gatekeepers, and lots of healthcare providers actually don't know a lot about trials, right? So I think just as a community, we should be thinking about, and we hear that from patients, that just knowing about trials and how do I find information, or if I talk to my healthcare provider and they tell me they don't think I should participate, I think we need to think about those kinds of barriers too. That's useful.
Thanks. Michelle?
Yeah, I just wanted to say for participants, I remember I had participated in a trial, and then a few months later, I saw like on YouTube just a presentation. I was like, hey, I was involved in that. And I really felt like, I was like, why wasn't I told about this YouTube? Like, so like really just keeping those lines of communication, if you have whether you're a participant or a partner, saying, hey, we're presenting this, or hey, and just keeping everyone in the loop. And it just makes you feel like your contribution mattered versus just finding out, oh yeah, I was involved in that, but I never knew about that.
Lauren?
I was just going to ask, like, what is the best way to communicate that back to the study participants? Like, do you want a newsletter, a website? Like, how can we as trialists get that information to you?
I think I've seen questions of like, do you want to hear the results of the study? And like, sometimes it's fine. It's like an email. Hey, just so you know, there's a poster session or there's a YouTube webinar, you might be interested on, and just make it optional, but it's nice. It's better to be having the invitation than to feel like you were excluded.
No, I'm going to put a plug in for a project. So Clinical Trials Ontario had a great tool, a communication tool for clinical trials. And another group of us with Dawn and with Clinical Trials Ontario, led by Nancy Butcher, developed a tool called CommuniKids. And so we sat down, we had several workshops with youth and with caregivers and asked them, how would you like the results of clinical trials communicated back to you? That's open access, anyone can use it. And it was really co-developed with them. So now there's an adult tool, and there's a tool for pediatrics that you can find on the Clinical Trials Ontario website. And it was a really interesting exercise. We held several workshops and just listening to what I was involved with the youth, the youth ones, and just hearing what they wanted, what was important to them to hear back when they had been in a trial was really interesting. So little plug there. Okay, I think, so one of the things that we talk about is like patient partners involved in your clinical trials. Dawn's going to give an example from a patient group involved, the example of the muscular dystrophy trial. And because we want to make sure that when we're talking about patient partners, we also include patient groups as partners. So I'll hand it back over to you, Dawn.
Thanks, Maureen. So I'm not sure if people have heard of this example, but in the US, there's a very active patient family-led organization related to Duchenne muscular dystrophy, and it's led by a Furlong. And so back in around 2010 or 2012 or so, they saw that there was going to be a lot more coming down the Duchenne pipeline. And they felt that potentially sponsors weren't completely prepared for what it would be like for participants to participate in trials. And they didn't feel like the FDA actually knew that much about their rare disease to get the community together, to get sponsors together, academics together. They did a ton of work as a small not-for-profit organization, and they developed guidance that they submitted to the FDA about what sponsors should take into consideration when they develop trials. So trial endpoints, what outcomes they should be measuring, et cetera. So they've written some peer-reviewed publications on this. They submitted that original guidance to the FDA back in like 2014, 2015. And then just in the past year or so, that's been updated. And the FDA, in this case, actually went to them and said, like, we would like to work with you collaboratively on this. Apparently that space had changed a lot, like gene therapies are coming down the pipe, biomarkers are really important. And again, they worked with the FDA and the whole community worked together to develop what is now the FDA guidance related to clinical trials in that area. So a couple of things there is like, one, the parents and the kids who live with Duchenne and the community really galvanized to tell the policymakers and the decision makers like how it should be, which is great on one hand, but on the other hand, that's also a massive burden for families who are already undergoing and dealing with a lot, right? So, you know, I don't mean to be the Debbie Downer, but it's like, it's a great story. But at the same time, on the flip side, I think we really need to think about some of the burdens that we create for people, or at least be mindful about what they're already dealing with in their lives. And I'm sure others on the panel can really speak to that a lot more than I can. So I'll just kind of leave that out there. There's all kinds of publications. If you just Google it, there's all kinds of great information about it that's out there.
That's great. And I'm going to ask my last very, very quick question and hand it over to end on a really positive note. Can someone name something that they saw happen in a clinical trial that improved, you know, tremendously the experience of the participants? Can you think of something that was done that was just like, well, this really had an impact? Anyone, rapid fire? Ron?
So one thing that I didn't mention that's an issue of access is that you need to have clinical trials. So for my son's condition, there aren't really clinical trials in Canada, but we took him to Mexico for a clinical trial for stem cells. And the thing that I experienced there was that the people there, and I've seen this in other areas in Canada, parents and patients were treated like they mattered. And that's the kind of emphasis I want to put, is that if you feel like you matter, then that kind of engagement potentially can lead to a better outcome, but also that there won't be attrition with parents. And so there's a lot that's invested in participating in research. It's been mentioned that compensation can sometimes play a role, but it depends on the person. And I obviously come from a place of privilege where I have access to an income that allows my wife to primarily concentrate on our son. But I think the important thing for us is that we feel like we matter and that there's value in him. So I think sometimes that's a thing that people have as a natural skill. When we went to Mexico, it was like everybody was saying, we're here to help your son. We're going to do, you know, as best as we can. And it was a phase 2 trial, and it didn't end up leading anywhere for him, but it still could for someone else. And we were happy to participate.
That's great. Thanks, Ron. So if you have a question, raise your hand. And we'd love to hear, if you want to tell us your name or where you're coming from, that would be great. And if you have your question for a specific person, just say that. And if it's an open question, that's good too. So We're here.
Sure. Hi, my name is Justine. I am a postdoctoral fellow at IWK Health in Halifax. My question is kind of for everybody. So we all know the importance of engaging patients, but that first step of finding new patient partners for a new project, I was wondering if you could tell us either about how you were approached to be involved or how you think like approaching patient partners could work in various settings, whether it's clinical or a non-clinical population.
That's a great question, Justine.
Great question. So a few things that I would suggest more on the lens of recruiting youth, recruiting parents. I don't have lived experience in that, so not going to touch on that. But for youth, I would recommend two places. The first, there is a Youth in Research Instagram page, which is great, especially for youth who are already engaged in research. That's not really how you're going to find youth who don't know anything about research. My other recommendation would be through like most children's hospitals I found like have a child like advisory group of current patients who might not be currently involved in research, but they are currently involved in like their health, wanting to give back, have a chronic condition. So reaching out that way, often the child life specialists at the hospitals have connections that way, people in research who again are youth who might not have been involved in previous projects, which is a great place to start. So those are the two places that I would recommend for like reliably sourcing youth.
Thanks, Trinity. Anybody else? Michelle?
Yeah, there is a Facebook page if you're looking for parents partnering in research Facebook page. But I think what Lauren's message yesterday is really about building communities. So if there is a community, it just keeps building and getting bigger, and you're involving more and more people, and the more like different groups are building different communities, it will all just become one big thing, and so it won't even be an issue hopefully in the future.
Ron?
So, I mean, this reminds me, and I've had this complaint, if you live in a smaller center, which I do in Ontario, in Niagara, if I go to McMaster, I see signs for recruitment next to the elevators. It's like that's the tactic. But if I'm not going there, which is, I might have cause to go there because of an emergency, but otherwise 3 months might elapse. I'm not going to see that. And so I think communicating with tertiary level centers actually is key, because we see them all the time. We go in there all the time, and I never hear about a research study at that level. So I think, across Canada, there's these tertiary level centers that could be telling people about research opportunities.
I'll throw my recommendation in that. Inform Rare, we engage with between 20 and 25 people on our project. And the majority of our patient partners come from the 3 patient groups that we deal with. And we get a mixture, like some of our patient partners, it's not their first rodeo, they've done this before, but we have a lot of people who are engaging for the first time, and we found them through their patient group. It also gives credibility, because that means that the patient group is, they're involved in the research and they're supporting you. And for some people who maybe have mistrust in researchers, that could be something that's really important to them, to have that kind of stamp of approval too, because there are communities who've been done wrong by researchers, and that's really important too. So that's a great question. And a lot of people want to get started and don't really know how. So. Okay, next question.
Hi, thank you. My name is Quinn Doan. I'm the Senior Executive Director for the BC Children's Hospital Research Institute. And this question is for you, Maureen, and perhaps Dawn and maybe Lauren. When you asked about what other barriers have not been mentioned, and there's one I know that everybody has heard before, but it wasn't mentioned because no one on your panel has this experience. And that's a common thing. It's the language barrier. And when you engage patients, and you only engage people who speak English and French, national language, official languages, you will miss out a whole lot of experience of patients and families who can't communicate in these languages, at least not written. So what are we doing when we're organizing, when we are facilitating and creating, doing about that? What's the next step? How can we organize and actually include families who have language barriers?
We have a session on that this afternoon. So it's a really, we have a session on that this afternoon. It's a huge question. Even getting English and French, the two languages is difficult. And in thinking about all of the other languages, I think that people are looking at it all the time, but how much is actually getting done? I don't know. We're all very aware of it, but what's the action plan? I think that's the bottom line. And I'll let Dawn or Lauren add to that, but
I'm not sure I can add to that, Quinn. I feel like you probably know more given the research that you're doing in this area. So I probably don't have much that I can add to that, but thanks for bringing it up because it's super, super important.
Michelle's
I can add. So I would just say, just do it. Like pick your community, because I know a lot of the eligibility is like you must speak English, but like say, pick a community that maybe doesn't speak English and just start doing it, and you're going to learn. And then you can learn from that what went well, what didn't go well. And I know we're going to hear from some people later on today. One of the fellows will have something to say about that. So we'll save that for later.
Yes. Hi, everyone. My name is Antonio. I'm from McGill University. So I'm only just entering the field of clinical trials. So I'm new to all of this because so far I've been doing preclinical research where there's no patient engagement. So my question is, how many patients do you think it's, if I'm starting a clinical trial, should I engage one person, 10 people, 100 people? The more, the better, or just, some representative of different, I don't know, sex, gender, ethnicity. What's your thoughts on this?
So the project that I was involved in, I think the intention was just to have one, and they ended up talking with a few groups, and everyone was like, okay, I'm just one voice. And so they were very flexible and they were able to accommodate, and they ended up having 4. So I think definitely more than one is important, because you're not going to get the wide range of opinions, and definitely, just get one that doesn't speak English, just do it. And I think it was really important, the approach. It was, we've never done this before. How do you see this happening? Let's get to know each other. And, when you're coming from, we're going to build rapport, we're going to get to know each other and build trust, then that's how it just happens organically versus just okay, we've decided it's going to look like this. It can be organic.
I agree, with variation, not a hard strict rule, but if you're looking for a place to start, 3 to 5 is a good number. For us on C4T, we were 3 to start with, and any less, you're not representing enough voices. There's not enough discussion or points to be made between 2 people, but the higher you get, you're not going to be as productive. So as long as you have a group that's as representative as possible of your participant population within reason, good place to start. But again, you need to consider your budget and other things and who your partners are. If they ask for more, if they ask for less, but to accommodate for them.
That's good. I'm going to use my moderator's privilege, Antonio, and add to that. So the only lonely patient is a bad look. We try to stay away from having just one person. 2 is the minimum. And what you can do is you can have levels of engagement. So you can engage with 2 or 3 people at a very high level. We are working very, very closely with them. And they might say, yeah, okay, we want to hear from more people. So we're going to have a focus group and we're going to bring them in and we're going to listen to what they say. And that they're more advisors on the project, more than partners. So you can kind of level it, because you can't work closely with 25 people, but you can work with a small group who then reaches out. And when you work with those partners, they have connections and they will help you set that up. So really glad that you're coming into this clinical trial space, and you know where you can find us all if you have questions. So happy to help you. So a round of applause for our great panel.